The African Union Observer Mission is holding a media joint briefing. Let's go live to Kenya, where the former president, Thabo Mbeki, is speaking.
20, 30, 15 minutes later, depending on what had happened when they opened. And indeed, by the time we went to witness the closing of the stations, the ending of the balloting, majority of the stations, there were no queues, and whoever had was remaining, they were actually given the right, the possibility to vote. The counting in the polling stations went through in a very orderly and very transparent manner, with the presiding officers making sure that especially the party agents were able to inspect each of the ballot papers to see how people had voted, as well as to see the mark, the stamp of the IEBC at the back of the ballot paper. And indeed, the counting having been done, then they filled in the form as required by the law, and we saw the party agents also endorsing those forms. Followed, of course, by the filling in of the details on this electronic machine, including the copying, the scanning of that 34A form. All of this was done with the party agents observing the entering of that material in the electronic equipment, and therefore the decision taken together by the presiding officers and the party agents that therefore you can now submit this to the IEBC and the constituency offices. And so our conclusion really is that we know that the IEBC is still involved in a process of tallying the votes. It has therefore not announced any results as at the time of the preparation of this preliminary report. This means that as the electoral process is continuing, it may be premature to make a final statement. However, the AU Election Observer Mission is very pleased to say that the elections were peaceful, and on election day, August 8th, the population went into the polling stations in large numbers, and the people were permitted to vote in a manner which met the standards set in Kenya law, which was also consistent with the policies of the African Union. And similarly, the process of counting the votes at the polling stations was done in a transparent manner, with the participation of the agents of the political parties. And the forms reflecting the information were then agreed by both the IEBC presiding officers and the party agents. And with the party agents observing, this information was then entered into the devices, and the forms were scanned using the same electronic equipment, with all this material then being electronically transmitted to the IEBC tallying center and the constituency tallying centers. Accordingly, we can say that the processes, as we were able to observe, up to and including the counting of the votes at the polling stations and their transmission to the IEBC and so on, met the standards set by Kenya and the AU for the conduct of democratic elections. The AU Election Observer Mission has taken note of concerns that have been expressed by some stakeholders relating to the tallying of the votes and therefore the ultimate outcome of the elections. And in this regard, the AU Election Observer Mission calls upon all stakeholders to work together to address these concerns, relying especially on the institutions legally established to organize the elections, and especially the IEBC. The AU Election Observer Mission will continue with its work as the electoral process has not yet been concluded. It therefore reserves the right to make such other additional comments as might be necessary later. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That's our preliminary statement, and as I was saying, the members of the press will get your copy of the statement. Thanks.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We will give some time for questions. So if you have questions from the media, can you put up your hand? You don't? Okay, I've seen 2 hands. Oh, okay, pray now. Okay. The first person on my right. Yes, go ahead.
Daniel Finnan, Radio France International. What discussions did you have with opposition leader Raila Odinga yesterday, Your Excellency?
What was the question? What discussions did we have? No, the Honorable Raila Odinga and the members' leadership of NASA, they asked to meet with the international observer missions. We agreed to that, and we all therefore met them. They came and they gave a report concerning what they called, they described as the hacking of the server of the IEBC. And then they distributed a document to the observer missions, which they say it represents the process of the hacking. People like myself who are illiterate in terms of technology couldn't understand it, but it was distributed to the observer missions. A question was posed as to how they had acquired the document, because the document presumably is said to represent what happened in the server as a result of the hacking. And they said, no, they had been given a particular key by the IEBC to be able to access the server. And so they explained, and we said, well, thank you very much, we've listened to you, but then said that we don't know, of course, whether, because we didn't observe it, whether the hacking took place or didn't take place, but we were very confident that by resort to what the law requires, that is, resort to the 34A form, filled in and signed and so on, and the polling stations, going through those forms and producing, therefore, the 34B form from the constituencies, it would be possible, therefore, to be able for the parties, IBC, everybody concerned, to all the necessary calculations, regardless of what might have happened in the event that there was any hacking. Of course, the NASA people then expressed their own reservations about the accuracy of those 34A forms, because they said that in a number of the stations, they didn't have any party observers of their own, and in some of them, they were turned away, their agents, and indeed said that there would also be a process going on, even as we were meeting them yesterday, of altering the results as represented in those 34A forms. So that was their report. So we said, well, we're observers. It's our obligation to listen to everybody, as we're glad that we had the opportunity to listen to NASA. And thank you very much for your information. Goodbye. So that was the discussion that took place.
Yes, the next person. The lady, or you want to ask the question again? Okay, there was a hand here. Go ahead.
My name is Owero Nibura from Inoro TV. Your Excellency, the NASA presidential candidate yesterday accused you and other observer missions, by way of extension, of participating in a process of making a case for the election by merely looking at it on face value without doing investigative observation. What would be your response to him?
No, the point was made very clear to the NASA delegation that we are observer missions. And the task of the observer missions is to observe. And that's all we did. Observers observed, and we observed what happened at the voting stations, what happened before the voting took place, what happened, as I was saying, you know, filling in this electronic form and so on, the countersigning by the agents. Those are the things we observed. The matters that relate to, for instance, the allegation about interference, hacking of the server of the IEBC, surely that's why we're saying that's a complaint that needs to be lodged with the IEBC. And the IEBC, obviously together with the parties concerned, would then also do the necessary investigation. That's not observation. We're not an African Union election investigation mission. We're an African Union election observer mission, as are all of the others, the EU, the Carter Center, COMESA, East African Community, IGAD, and etc. We're all election observer missions. And all our mandates, without exception, will say, please go to the Republic of Kenya to observe, not to investigate. I think they understood that very well.
Okay. The two hands on my left, and then we take one here and we conclude.
Hi, I'm Kenyan Elections, freelance journalist from South Africa. President Mbeki, I have a question about what you said before the elections. You said the AU is not there merely to observe, but also if there are problems, to help with those problems and to help resolve them. Did you find it necessary to get involved in your observers? Did they find it necessary to get involved in resolving any problems?
Yes, indeed, you're quite correct. We've said that as the AU, obviously, if we saw, as we're observing, if we saw something that was going wrong in terms of what the law of Kenya requires, and indeed in terms of the procedures, the expectations of the African Union in terms of its own African Charter on democracy, elections, and so on, we would indeed intervene. And everybody accepted this, all of the presidential candidates accepted that, the IEBC accepted that, and everybody. So what has happened as a consequence is that in a number of instances, NASA in particular has lodged complaints with us, with our observer mission, with regard to the conduct of the elections, matters, for instance, like the availability of the voters register, as well as matters that have to do with security, like at some point, a story about the transfer of 42 police officers out of the police service to somewhere else, and NASA saying that those people are going to be used for rigging, with a request that we should take up these matters, which we did. So we had to interact with the IEBC whenever we received complaints, to say to the IEBC, we are messengers, we are carrying a message from so-and-so, which says the following, what do we report back, and then we would report back to the person who complains. And similarly, with regard to security matters, when they were raised, we would discuss them with the acting Cabinet Secretary for Interior. We've had a number of meetings with him to discuss the various matters that were raised relating to security. And therefore, that is the role that...
There, the former President Thabo Mbeki, of course, he's the head of the African Union's observer mission at the Kenyan elections. Now, in the next hours, we'll get a little bit more updates. But as the former president just pointed out there, that complaints were lodged with them. But that's from the opposition, Raila Odinga, who talked about issues of rigging the electoral system and especially the voting system that was hacked into. We'll delve into that a little bit later. Of course, former President Thabo Mbeki pointed out that it is not the AU observer mission that can deal with that, only the election authorities in Kenya.